Welcome to Book Central Inside the Pages. I'm Steve, stepping in for Abby today. She's having a well-deserved rest, and I'll be keeping her seat warm while she recharges. For those who don't know me, I'm a military veteran who has complex military PTSD. I've also published 5 military fiction books. Today, we're diving into a conversation that strikes close to home for many veterans, both on and off the page, the origins of military PTSD and its treatment. I'm joined by someone who knows the topic from the inside out, Dr. Tony Blackwell. Tony's not only a former military doctor but also a physiatrist and expert in physical medicine and rehabilitation. He's also an author, exploring these complex issues in his own writing. Thanks for being here, Tony.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's great to be here, and I have to say, I admire your work as well. You bring a lot of these themes to life in your stories.
Tony, let's dive straight in. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, has become a big topic in the past few decades, but it's not a new thing. Soldiers have been dealing with the after effects of combat for as long as there's been war. What's your take on the origins of PTSD in the military?
Absolutely, Steve. You're right, it's as old as war itself. We've seen it recorded as early as ancient Greece. Soldiers would return from battles showing signs of what we now call PTSD. But back then, it wasn't understood. It was often written off as cowardice or weakness, which only compounded the trauma. As you can imagine, not having the right words for what you're feeling can make things worse.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of soldiers can relate to, feeling like they can't talk about what's really going on in their heads. In your time as a military doctor, how did you see this play out on the ground?
It was a mix of things. In my early days, there was still a lot of stigma attached to mental health in the forces. You had these soldiers who'd just seen unimaginable things, but when it came to talking about it, many would bottle it up. The mentality was still, just get on with it. But we're talking about deep psychological wounds. They need more than time to heal.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember when I was serving, there was this expectation to just push through. You don't really want to show any cracks because it feels like the whole thing could crumble if you do. It's a hard cycle to break. Do you think that was part of why PTSD wasn't really talked about back then?
Definitely. There's a deeply ingrained idea in the military that mental toughness is the key to survival. And it is, to a certain extent. But there's a point where toughness turns into suppression, and that's where the trouble starts. Soldiers would keep everything bottled up, thinking that was the only way to cope, but those unprocessed experiences would come back to haunt them.
Yeah, I've seen that happen. And I think there's this idea that if you admit you're struggling, you're somehow less capable, like you're not fit for duty anymore. But that's not the case at all, is it?
Not at all. In fact, recognizing that you're struggling and need help is one of the strongest things a soldier can do. It's like a soldier taking care of a physical wound. It's about healing so you can keep fighting. Mental health is no different.
So, PTSD is something that's been around forever, but treatment for it has come a long way. When did we really start to understand PTSD in a medical sense? When did the shift from shell shock to PTSD happen?
We really started to make progress during and after the World Wars. Soldiers were coming back with what they called shell shock during World War I and battle fatigue in World War II. At first, they thought it was purely a physical condition, maybe from the concussive blasts of explosions. But over time, they began to realize that it was psychological. These soldiers were experiencing trauma that didn't just go away when the war ended.
Right, I've read about that. They used to think it was something wrong with the body, didn't they? Like the brain had been rattled too much.
Exactly. But as the understanding of mental health evolved, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, we began to see PTSD as a psychological response to trauma. The term post-traumatic stress disorder was officially recognized in 1980 by the American Psychiatric Association. That was a turning point because it gave us a framework for understanding what was happening to these veterans. It wasn't just a temporary reaction to stress, it was a real, ongoing condition that needed to be treated.
And how has the treatment evolved since then? I imagine we've come a long way from just telling soldiers to rest and get back to it.
Oh, we've come a long way, indeed. Back then, rest was really the only prescription. But today, we have a range of treatments. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is one of the most effective. It helps patients reframe their thinking, change their patterns of behavior, and process their traumatic experiences in a safe environment. There's also EMDR, which uses eye movements to help the brain reprocess traumatic memories.
Eye movements. How does that work exactly?
It sounds strange at first, but it's really about how the brain stores traumatic memories. When someone experiences trauma, their brain sometimes gets stuck in that moment, replaying it over and over. EMDR uses guided eye movements to help the brain reprocess the memory, so it's no longer as distressing. It's been very effective for many veterans.
That's fascinating. So, it's about helping the brain move past the trauma, not just suppress it.
Exactly. And that's a key point. Suppressing trauma only leads to more problems down the road. The goal is to help veterans confront their experiences in a way that allows them to heal.
That's really important, facing the trauma instead of running from it. But for a lot of veterans, that first step must be the hardest. From your experience, Tony, what does that first step look like for someone dealing with PTSD?
It's incredibly tough. For many veterans, the first step is simply admitting that something's wrong. There's often a lot of guilt or shame attached to that. Soldiers are trained to be strong, to push through pain, both physical and mental. So, when they start to feel like they're struggling, they may see it as a personal failure, rather than recognizing it as a very human response to trauma.
Yeah, I think that's a huge hurdle, just admitting that you need help. It's almost like you're fighting against everything you've been taught to do. How do you help someone get past that mental block?
It's about normalizing the experience. I often remind veterans that PTSD is not a sign of weakness. It's a normal response to an abnormal situation. War is not a normal experience, and it's okay to have a reaction to it. Once they understand that, it's easier for them to take that first step toward getting help.
I think that's something a lot of us need to hear. You're not broken because you're struggling, you're human. And that's a big shift in thinking.
It really is. And once veterans make that shift, they're more open to seeking treatment, whether that's talking to a therapist, joining a support group, or exploring some of the newer treatments we've talked about.
I can imagine that for a lot of veterans, writing could be a way to process some of those feelings. You're an author yourself, Tony. Do you think writing can be therapeutic for people dealing with PTSD?
Absolutely. Writing is a powerful way to process trauma. When you put things down on paper, it gives you a sense of control over your experiences. It helps you make sense of things that might feel overwhelming in your head. For many veterans, writing becomes a form of self-therapy. It's a way to externalize the trauma and begin to work through it.
Yeah, I know that's been true for me. Writing military fiction has been a way for me to process some of my own experiences, even if I'm not writing directly about myself. Do you think veterans who might not see themselves as writers could still benefit from writing as a therapeutic tool?
Definitely. You don't have to be a professional writer to benefit from putting your thoughts down on paper. It could be journaling, poetry, or even just stream of consciousness writing. The point isn't to create a polished piece of work, it's to give yourself an outlet. And sometimes, when veterans start writing, they find that it helps them in ways they didn't expect.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's not about writing a bestseller, it's about finding a way to express what's inside. In your book, you talk about narrative therapy. Can you explain what that is and how it relates to PTSD treatment?
Sure. Narrative therapy is based on the idea that we all create stories about our lives, and these stories shape how we see ourselves and the world around us. For veterans dealing with PTSD, those stories can often be negative. They see themselves as victims of their trauma. Narrative therapy helps them rewrite those stories. Instead of being a victim, they can see themselves as a survivor, someone who has overcome incredible challenges. It's about changing the narrative and finding meaning in their experiences.
That's really powerful. I think for a lot of veterans, it's easy to get stuck in the negative parts of their story. But being able to reframe it as something they've survived, that's a game changer. So, Tony, for any veterans listening who might be struggling but aren't sure where to start, what's the one thing you'd want them to take away from this conversation?
The most important thing I'd want them to know is that they're not alone. PTSD can make you feel isolated, like you're stuck in your own head, but there are so many resources available. Whether it's reaching out to a doctor, talking to a friend, or finding a support group, the first step is realizing that help is out there. You don't have to go through this on your own.
That's solid advice. I think it's time we all realize that asking for help isn't the end of the battle, it's the start of winning it. Tony, it's been an eye-opening chat today. I'm sure a lot of our listeners will have taken something from this conversation, whether they're veterans themselves or know someone who is. Thanks for sharing your insights and your time.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
And for those of you listening, if this conversation resonated with you or you'd like to know more, we'll have all the links up on the site. As always, thanks for joining us here at Books Central Inside the Pages. Until next time, stay safe and look out for each other. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We're back next week with more from the world of books and beyond. Until then, this is Steve, signing off.